Dawn arrived gently over the Pacific. The horizon stretched outward in every direction, flat and uninterrupted, a pale line where sea met sky. To the men aboard the Japanese fleet, it looked like safety itself, too empty, too vast to conceal real danger. Warships rode the water with measured confidence, their silhouettes steady, their decks clean. Nothing moved with urgency. Nothing suggested that history was already accelerating toward them. Within command rooms, the mood was assured. Reports of American carrier concentration circulated, but they were treated as exaggerations, misread signals, nervous speculation. The enemy, it was believed, lacked the coordination and daring required for large-scale carrier operations. Battleships still ruled the sea, and land-based air power remained the decisive arm. Carriers were auxiliaries, useful but fragile, never central. That belief had hardened into doctrine. Across the decks, sailors moved through morning routines with practiced calm. Steel plates were scrubbed clean. Guns sat idle, their barrels pointed harmlessly toward the sky. Signals flags hung slack in the still air. Breakfast was prepared below decks. Men spoke quietly, some joking, some thinking of home. Discipline held, but urgency did not. The fleet felt insulated by distance, doctrine, and confidence built over years of victory. Intelligence told a different story, but only in fragments. Intercepted transmissions contradicted aerial reconnaissance. Radar contacts were fleeting and uncertain. Each report, viewed alone, seemed inconclusive. Together, they formed a pattern no one fully assembled. Assumptions filled the gaps. The enemy could not be everywhere at once. Even if carriers were present, they would require time the fleet believed it still possessed. Then the radio spoke again. The message was brief, clipped, and unmistakably urgent. An approaching formation. Bearing uncertain. Distance closing. The bridge fell quiet as officers leaned over charts and scopes. Moments later, reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what doctrine said should not be possible. On the far edge of visibility, arranged with geometric precision, were not one or two carriers, but 17. They advanced together, coordinated and deliberate, filling the horizon with a kind of quiet menace. And in that moment, the order moved silently across the decks of 17 carriers, carried not by shouted commands, but by rehearsed precision. Aircraft were already positioned, engines warming, propellers cutting the still morning air, one by one. Then, in accelerating rhythm, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes rolled forward and vanished from the decks into the sky. Within minutes, the horizon above the American fleet filled with layered formations, climbing, aligning, and turning west as a single instrument. From the Japanese bridges, the first sight was almost abstract, small shapes multiplying, then resolving into intent. The attack did not arrive in fragments. It arrived whole. Bombs fell in timed intervals. Torpedoes entered the water on converging paths, each wave arriving just as the last forced defenders to look elsewhere. There was no single point of impact, no clear main effort. Everywhere was the strike. Battleships and cruisers reacted as doctrine demanded, but doctrine had not prepared them for this. Orders overlapped. Guns swung too late. Crews ran to stations under skies, already crowded with descending aircraft. Power that had been built to duel other ships now searched helplessly for targets moving faster than calculation. The first explosions tore through decks and superstructures before counterfire had fully begun. The dawn darkened unnaturally. Columns of smoke rose straight and thick, blotting out the horizon that had seemed so empty moments before. Fire spread across fuel lines and aircraft stores. Shock waves rippled through hulls. The sea itself appeared to burn as oil ignited on the surface. For those watching, the scale was disorienting. Too many impacts, too many fires, happening too quickly to track. Anti-aircraft fire intensified but remained uneven. Shells burst harmlessly below or behind their targets. The attacking waves stayed low, fast, and disciplined, exploiting every gap. Within hours, ships that had been pristine at sunrise were listing, aflame, or already slipping beneath the surface. Only then did the realization settle in. On both sides of the battle, this was not a raid, it was a demonstration. For the sailors on deck, the battle quickly lost any sense of structure. What they saw instead was scale too vast to process, too sudden to comprehend. Aircraft seemed to come from every direction at once. Explosions arrived without warning, not as single blows, but as a continuous pressure that bent steel and nerves alike. Men who had trained for years to face an enemy fleet now watched the sky, knowing that danger no longer came from the horizon, but from above it. Injuries followed without order. Shrapnel cut through exposed crews. Fires spread faster than they could be contained. Amid the confusion, discipline did not vanish, it fractured. Some sailors ran toward the flames, others away from them, all moving on instinct sharpened by fear. Acts of quiet bravery unfolded without witnesses. Men dragging wounded shipmates through smoke-filled corridors. Gunners staying at their posts until the mounts themselves were torn apart. Panic and courage existed side by side, indistinguishable in the noise. Below decks, radio operators worked in near darkness, hands shaking as they transmitted calls for assistance, damage reports, requests for orders. Many messages went unanswered. Antennas were destroyed. Frequencies overlapped. Commands sent minutes earlier no longer applied to a situation that had already changed. The battle moved faster than communication could follow. On the bridges, commanders struggled to impose order on events that refused it. Flags were raised, then obscured by smoke. Ships attempted to maneuver, only to discover that neighboring vessels were no longer where they had been moments before. Some were burning, some were silent, some were simply gone. Coordination, once assumed, collapsed under the weight of reality. By midday, losses were undeniable. Hulls lay open to the sea. Entire crews were missing. Survivors would later speak not of individual attacks, but of the sensation of being overwhelmed, of realizing that this was not an enemy improvising, but a system executing with precision. And with that realization came something more damaging than the physical losses. The certainty that had underpinned Japan's naval confidence began to erode, replaced by a question no doctrine had prepared them to answer. Long before the first aircraft appeared on the horizon, the outcome had already been shaped in briefing rooms far from the sea. Within Japan's naval high command, aircraft carriers occupied an uneasy place, acknowledged, yet never fully trusted. They were seen as useful extensions of power, not its foundation. The decisive blow, it was believed, would always come from battleships. Heavy guns, thick armor, and crews trained for line-of-battle engagements that had defined naval warfare for generations. This belief was not careless. It was earned through history. Shore-based aircraft, operating under controlled conditions and supported by fixed infrastructure, had proven their worth. Battleships had decided earlier conflicts through range, discipline, and firepower. Against these certainties, the carrier appeared fragile, dependent on weather, vulnerable to attack, and reliant on pilots who might miss, hesitate, or fail to return. In planning documents, carriers were often described as enablers, not arbiters. When reports arrived describing American carrier activity, they were filtered through this worldview. Previous U.S. operations had been limited in scope, raids, reconnaissance, probing attacks that withdrew before decisive engagement. These actions reinforced existing assumptions. The enemy, it seemed, lacked the experience or nerve to commit carriers en masse. What was observed was interpreted not as rehearsal, but as improvisation. As a result, confidence settled into planning, like sediment. Tactical discussions revolved around gunnery arcs, fleet formations, and decisive surface engagements. Exercises emphasized coordination between battleships and cruisers, while carriers remained peripheral, tasked with scouting or limited air cover. The possibility that air power itself could become the primary weapon was acknowledged in theory, then quietly set aside in practice. This was not ignorance, but inertia. Doctrine hardened faster than reality evolved. Officers trusted the tools they understood best, and the victories they already possessed. To question battleship supremacy was to question decades of professional identity. And so new evidence was weighed carefully, then discounted. The most dangerous assumptions are often the quietest ones. In this case, it was the belief that any carrier strike would be delayed, fragmented, or easily countered. That belief rested on a single missing piece of intelligence, a failure to grasp not just where the enemy's carriers were, but how many had been gathered and how thoroughly they had been integrated into a single striking force. By the time that absence became visible, it was no longer an abstract error. It was a material one, measured in burning decks and lost hulls. And as the fleet struggled to respond, one truth emerged with growing clarity. The weapon they had relegated to the margins was no longer waiting for permission to decide the battle. The failure was not a single mistake, but a sequence of small ones, each reinforcing the next. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew wide arcs over empty ocean, returning with reports that confirmed expectation rather than reality. Weather obscured sightlines. Search patterns favored known approaches. Gaps between patrols went unexamined. The sea was vast, and confidence filled the spaces intelligence did not. Fleet commanders calculated time as they always had. Even if American carriers were present, assembling an effective strike would take hours, perhaps days. Aircraft would need to be spotted, fueled, armed, and coordinated across dispersed decks. Such an operation, it was believed, could not be concealed. Warning would arrive long before impact. That assumption shaped every decision that followed. Underlying it was a deeper conviction that surprise belonged to Japan. Years of doctrine had emphasized stealth, initiative, and the carefully timed opening blow. These qualities had served them well before, and success had turned method into identity. The enemy, by contrast, was seen as procedural and cautious, capable of strength, but slow to concentrate it. To imagine otherwise required abandoning a narrative that had already proven comforting. As a result, the scale of the American carrier force went unrecognized. Reports that hinted at multiple task groups were treated as duplication errors or misidentification. Coordination between carriers, once thought unwieldy, was dismissed as impractical. No allowance was made for the possibility that air power itself had become a system, not a collection of platforms. Even as the U.S. fleet maneuvered into position, Japanese confidence remained intact. Movements detected on radar were intermittent and poorly interpreted. Signals intelligence lagged behind events already unfolding. Coordination between air and surface units assumed a tempo that no longer existed. Each misreading fed the next, creating a loop in which reassurance replaced analysis. What made these errors dangerous was not their novelty, but their familiarity. Radar was still treated as an adjunct rather than a central sensor. Air power was evaluated by sortie counts, not by integration. Coordination was measured vertically, ship to ship, rather than horizontally across an entire strike network. The enemy's advantage lay precisely in those neglected dimensions. When the first bombs fell, the revelation was immediate and unforgiving. The strike had not required time. It had required preparation, already completed beyond the horizon. What Japanese planners had believed impossible was already overhead. In the space of hours, by the time the warning signs accumulated, Japanese defenses existed in a state that could best be described as alert but unready. Watches were posted, crews were present, guns were manned in theory. Yet, much of this readiness was procedural rather than practical, designed for engagements the fleet expected, not for the one now forming beyond the horizon. Anti-aircraft positions reflected this mismatch. Some mounts were incomplete, others poorly positioned, their fields of fire overlapping inefficiently or leaving gaps unprotected. Fire control systems, adequate for slower, higher-flying targets, struggled to track fast-moving aircraft attacking in coordinated waves. Corrections lagged behind reality. By the time solutions were calculated, the targets had already passed through the envelope of effective fire. Below decks, damage control teams prepared as they had trained. For isolated hits, contained fires, manageable flooding. Their drills assumed pauses between impacts, moments to assess and respond. What they faced instead was continuity fires igniting as others were still being fought, compartments flooding while adjacent decks were already compromised. Equipment functioned as designed, but the scale rendered it insufficient. Logistical planning revealed similar assumptions. Supply lines were robust on paper, repair facilities capable under ordinary strain. The expectation was survival first, restoration later. No provision had been made for a scenario in which multiple ships would require immediate, simultaneous recovery, if recovery was possible at all. Planning had anticipated damage, not paralysis. At the officer level, confidence filled the gaps. Preparation left behind. Previous encounters had reinforced belief in repeatable outcomes. The enemy would probe, retreat, regroup. The fleet would absorb, respond, and pursue. These patterns had become predictive models, trusted because they were familiar. Few questioned whether the enemy might deliberately break them. Morale and discipline remained strong, and in another context, they might have compensated for material shortcomings. Crews followed orders precisely. Routines were maintained, even as uncertainty grew. But discipline can conceal fragility as easily as it sustains strength. Order persisted, masking how little flexibility remained once that order was disrupted. What no drill had addressed was absence, specifically, the absence of warning. As carriers closed, the distance undetected, they exploited not only gaps in radar coverage and reconnaissance, but habits of thought. Technology failed, where doctrine had already surrendered. And when the first wave struck, the fleet discovered that preparation is not measured by readiness to respond. The assault unfolded not as a single blow, but as a sequence so tightly arranged it appeared continuous. From 17 carriers spread across the ocean, aircraft rose in disciplined waves, fighters climbing to clear the sky, bombers forming above them, torpedo planes skimming low and steady over the water. Each launch was timed against the others, each deck contributing to a design far larger than any single ship could perceive. Pilots followed flight paths drawn weeks earlier and memorized until instinctive. Altitudes were assigned, headings fixed, intervals calculated to the minute. Formation was not a matter of appearance, but of survival. To break it was to invite isolation. To hold it was to become part of a moving system, where individual aircraft mattered less than the geometry they formed together. Over open ocean, hundreds of miles from land, they navigated by training, instruments, and trust. As the formations closed in, anti-aircraft fire intensified, filling the sky with bursts of black smoke and tracer arcs. Yet the attackers did not scatter. Fighters peeled away at prearranged points, drawing fire upward. Bombers adjusted speed and altitude with subtle precision. Torpedo planes weaved just enough to disrupt targeting without losing alignment. Losses occurred, but fewer than defenders expected. Evasion had been planned as carefully as attack. What distinguished this strike was not only its scale, but its simultaneity. Different targets were engaged at once: battleships, cruisers, support vessels, each under assault from multiple directions. Commanders searching for a main effort found none. Every impact felt decisive. Fires ignited faster than they could be counted. Damage reports overlapped and contradicted one another. The fleet faced not a single crisis, but many, unfolding together. Japanese responses fractured under the pressure. Orders issued from one sector conflicted with those from another. Communications lagged, then failed. Guns shifted targets too late, or not at all. The speed of the attack outpaced the hierarchy designed to control it. What had once been an organized formation became a collection of ships fighting independently, each reacting to its own immediate threat. Above them, air crews returned again and again. Pilots assessed damage visually, adjusted angles of attack, and relayed observations before landing to refuel and rearm. Vulnerabilities were shared, refined, and exploited on subsequent runs. What began as a plan evolved into a living operation shaped by constant feedback. Technology provided the reach. Human judgment provided the adaptation. Hours into the assault, the pattern held. Strikes overlapped seamlessly, denying the defenders any pause to regroup. Fatigue set in, but discipline remained. Engineers kept flight decks operational under strain. Controllers managed traffic with precision measured in seconds. Each roll mattered. Each action compounded the next. This was not merely air power at work. It was organization made visible, training translated into motion, planning into consequence. Across the fleet, destruction ceased to be episodic and became continuous. Fires burned unchecked along exposed decks, fed by ruptured fuel lines and shattered aircraft. Explosions rippled through hulls as magazines detonated or bulkheads gave way under pressure. Water rushed inward through torn plating, turning compartments into traps. Ships that had once moved with confidence now fought simply to remain afloat. Damage control teams responded with discipline and speed, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Hoses were deployed into smoke so thick it erased direction. Pumps strained against flooding that exceeded their capacity. Men worked by touch as much as sight, sealing hatches, reinforcing bulkheads, and carrying the wounded through passages that no longer resembled their original layout. Training guided their hands, but the scale of the crisis denied them time. On the bridges, officers abandoned formal plans and began to improvise. Signals were sent by flag and light when radios failed. Maneuvers were ordered to bring undamaged guns to bear or to shield stricken vessels. Some ships attempted to launch aircraft into skies already crowded with attackers. Others tried to withdraw, only to find themselves boxed in by fire and debris. Coordination became reactive, driven by necessity rather than intent. Above them, the strikes did not relent. Aircraft returned in steady succession, denying the fleet any opportunity to stabilize. Each pause was measured in seconds, not minutes. Just as fires were brought under control, fresh explosions reopened them. Just as flooding was slowed, another torpedo widened the breach. The rhythm of the attack dictated the tempo of survival. American pilots adapted as the battle evolved. They marked ships already damaged and redirected effort toward those still maneuvering. Bombers altered release points to exploit weakened armor. Torpedo planes adjusted approaches to avoid new defensive patterns. Observations were shared rapidly, turning individual experience into collective advantage. What had been planned became refined in real time. This adaptability was not improvisation alone. It rested on structure briefings that encouraged initiative, communication channels designed to absorb feedback, and leadership that trusted aircrews to make decisions within intent. Technology provided the platform, but it was human judgment that transformed opportunity into effect. Precision was no longer just mechanical, it was interpretive. As the hours passed, the horizon transformed into something unrecognizable. Smoke columns merged into a single dark mass. Fires reflected off the water, blurring the boundary between sea and sky. Wreckage drifted through oil-slicked waves. The geometry of the fleet dissolved into chaos, isolated hulls, drifting debris, and scattered survivors clinging to anything that floated. For those watching from the air, the scene carried a stark clarity. This was not simply destruction. It was the visible collapse of a system unable to adapt as quickly as its opponent. And with each successful adjustment, the outcome grew less uncertain. What remained unanswered was not whether the fleet could recover, but whether anything could interrupt the sequence now unfolding, before adaptation on one side erased all remaining resistance on the other. Amid the wreckage, individual actions regained meaning. Sailors moved through smoke-filled corridors toward the sound of shouting, pulling shipmates clear of collapsed bulkheads and flooded compartments. Jammed guns were struck back into motion with improvised tools. Engines damaged by shrapnel were coaxed into brief life, long enough to change a ship's heading or restore power to a critical system. Survival depended not on orders, but on immediate judgment made under pressure. Rescue efforts unfolded in conditions that defied comprehension. Fires burned so hot they bent steel, yet men crossed open decks to reach the wounded. Explosions interrupted every movement, scattering debris and forcing rescuers to begin again. Stretchers were passed hand to hand through narrow passages, slick with oil and water. The battlefield had no clear boundary. It existed wherever someone needed help, and another chose to answer. Within this chaos, acts of leadership took on their simplest form. Officers abandoned protected positions to direct damage control teams in person, pointing out hazards, assigning tasks, steadying crews whose world had narrowed to flame and noise. Rank mattered less than presence. Authority was earned moment by moment, measured in calm instructions delivered when fear threatened to overwhelm discipline. Above the burning fleet, American pilots faced a different kind of endurance. Many flew multiple sorties without rest, returning to their carriers low on fuel, landing amid the constant motion of deck crews racing to prepare the next launch. Faces were streaked with sweat and oil. Fatigue slowed reaction times, but routine held. Each pilot knew where to taxi, when to shut down, when to climb back into another aircraft. The cycle continued without pause. On the carriers themselves, engineers worked below decks under relentless strain. Machinery overheated, components failed, spare parts vanished faster than inventories could be updated. Yet flight operations never fully stopped. Power was rerouted. Damaged systems were bypassed. Maintenance crews improvised solutions, measured not in durability, but in minutes gained. Each successful launch extended the offensive and denied the enemy respite. What sustained this momentum was coordination, a web of actions connected by trust. Pilots trusted deck crews to clear paths. Crews trusted engineers to keep systems alive. Commanders trusted subordinates to act without constant supervision. Courage flowed through these connections, not as isolated bravery, but as collective resolve. By the time the final waves returned, the result was clear. Success had not been achieved by machines alone, nor by individual heroics in isolation. It emerged from the alignment of training, planning, and human will. Technology amplified skill. Skill rewarded courage. Together, They produced an outcome that reshaped the battlefield. And as the smoke drifted and the fires burned lower, the surviving ships on both sides stood as witnesses to a truth the sea had revealed once again. Mastery in war belongs not to those who possess tools, but to those who understand how far human effort can carry them when those tools are finally put to the test. The decisive phase arrived without ceremony. It announced itself through simultaneity. Across the battered fleet, key vessels were struck almost at once, bombs tearing through decks already weakened, torpedoes opening hulls that had lost the ability to maneuver. Fires leapt from compartment to compartment, fed by fuel and ammunition that damage control teams no longer had the means to isolate. What had survived earlier waves now faced destruction without margin. Anti-aircraft defenses attempted one final concentration of effort, but coordination had collapsed. Fire control directors struggled to assign targets through smoke and interference. Ammunition ran low. Crews fought bravely, yet their fire no longer converged. Aircraft passed through defensive zones with increasing impunity. What had once been a layered shield dissolved into isolated points of resistance, each overwhelmed in turn. Torpedo strikes proved especially decisive. Released at close range and on converging angles, they struck below the waterline where armor was weakest. Multiple hulls were disabled within minutes, rudders jammed, engines flooded, compartments torn open to the sea. Ships that had remained afloat through fire and bombing now lost the ability to steer or maintain speed. Some slowed, others stopped entirely, becoming fixed targets amid open water. The attackers did not withdraw once these blows landed. Aircraft returned for follow-up strikes with deliberate intent. Fires were reignited. Flooding was worsened. Any attempt at recovery was interrupted before it could stabilize. The logic was unforgiving. A damaged ship left untouched might be saved. One struck again would not. The sequence continued until resistance faded into inevitability. From command positions, Japanese officers watched the balance tilt beyond recovery. Tactical maps no longer reflected reality. Icons representing ships failed to update, then vanished. Orders issued minutes earlier no longer had recipients. The advantage, once measured in theoretical strength and positional doctrine, now belonged unmistakably to the attackers. Control had shifted not gradually, but all at once. As cohesion broke down, initiative vanished with it. Individual ships attempted to withdraw or regroup, but without coordination, their movements conflicted. Some turned into the path of incoming aircraft. Others masked one another's fire. The fleet no longer acted as a unit. It reacted, ship by ship, moment by moment, always a step behind events already unfolding overhead. For the American commanders, the picture resolved with equal clarity. Reports confirmed what observation already suggested. The enemy's capacity to resist was collapsing. The carriers had achieved not only tactical success, but operational dominance. They dictated tempo, range, and outcome. The sea itself seemed to respond, marked by smoke columns and burning wreckage that traced the path of concentrated air power. By late afternoon, the horizon bore little resemblance to the one seen at dawn. It no longer stretched empty and serene. It burned. Steel ruptured under pressure. The sky above remained crowded with aircraft, moving with purpose against a backdrop. The realization did not arrive all at once. It emerged in fragments, carried by broken reports and incomplete signals that filtered through what remained of the command network. Japanese headquarters struggled to assemble a coherent picture of the battle, receiving casualty figures that seemed exaggerated, then discovering they were already outdated. The scale of the attack exceeded every pre-war estimate. What had been assumed impossible was now undeniable. As losses mounted, communication degraded further. Flag signals were obscured by smoke. Radio transmissions cut in and out as antennas were destroyed or power failed. Orders sent from senior command arrived too late to matter, or not at all. The battle unfolded faster than information could travel, leaving planners to react to events that had already passed beyond their influence. What stunned them most was not the damage itself, but the method by which it had been delivered. The coordination of carrier air groups operating at ranges, once thought impractical, challenged long-held assumptions about control and endurance. Strikes arrived from distances that defied previous calculations, their timing so precise that defenses never fully recovered between waves. This was not harassment. It was sustained dominance. The rapidity of destruction forced a reassessment mid-battle. Battleships that should have anchored resistance were rendered ineffective before their main guns could shape the engagement. Cruisers and escorts, designed to screen and support, found themselves overwhelmed by a threat they could not close with or outrun. Concentrated air power had not merely supplemented surface combat, it had replaced it. Within the fleet, morale collapsed unevenly but decisively. Crews continued to fight, but the purpose shifted. Survival displaced victory. Ships maneuvered not to engage, but to escape. Damage control gave way to abandonment. The sense of fighting a winnable battle faded as the evidence accumulated overhead and around them. The sea, once a field of opportunity, became a barrier to retreat. In command rooms, far from the burning ships, the implications began to crystallize. The assumption of battleship superiority, carefully reasoned, deeply institutionalized, had failed under modern conditions. The fleet had been optimized for a battle that never occurred. The one that did had been decided before opposing ships ever exchanged gunfire. This recognition marked a psychological turning point more profound than the material losses themselves. Doctrine, once considered stable, was revealed as temporary. The carriers were no longer auxiliaries or scouts. They were the decisive instrument, capable of shaping battles beyond visual range and controlling outcomes before an enemy could respond. As the attack subsided and reports were finally reconciled, one conclusion became unavoidable. Naval warfare had crossed a threshold. What had been learned through theory and experimentation was now confirmed through destruction. The future would belong to those who mastered air power at sea. For Japan's planners, when the smoke began to thin, the strategic reality emerged with unmistakable clarity. Control of the sea was no longer determined by who held the strongest hulls or the largest guns, but by who decided when and where a battle would occur. In this new equation, American carriers now dictated both tempo and geography. Engagements unfolded on their schedule, at distances of their choosing, long before an enemy fleet could assemble a coherent response. For Japanese planners, the implications were immediate and unsettling. Offensive doctrine gave way to defensive necessity. Fleet operations were reassessed under the pressure of vulnerability, not ambition. Instead of seeking decisive surface engagements, commanders now had to consider how to avoid detection, how to disperse assets, and how to protect supply lines that had suddenly become exposed. The initiative had shifted, and with it, the rhythm of the war. The battle also revealed intelligence failures that could no longer be dismissed as chance. Gaps in reconnaissance were no longer theoretical risks, but operational liabilities. The inability to reliably track carrier movements meant that prediction, once the foundation of planning, became guesswork. Without timely information, even well-prepared forces found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. The fog of war had thickened, but only on one side. American operational flexibility exploited this imbalance. Carrier groups could reposition rapidly, strike unexpectedly, and withdraw before countermeasures formed. Air power extended influence far beyond the visible horizon, compressing decision timelines for the defender while expanding options for the attacker. What mattered was not territorial control, but the ability to project force where it would have the greatest effect. In doctrinal terms, the verdict was decisive. Carrier warfare had proven not merely viable, but dominant. When the battle finally loosened its grip on the sea, the scale of loss emerged slowly, piece by piece. Hundreds of sailors were dead. Many more were wounded, burned, fractured, concussed, or permanently altered by what they had endured. The chaos of the engagement did not end with the last explosion. It lingered in smoke-filled compartments, on blood-slicked decks, and in the silence that followed unanswered roll calls. Bodies were recovered where possible, carried reverently past twisted steel and shattered equipment. Others were never found, lost to fire or the sea with no marker but memory. Medical teams worked without pause, improvising triage stations in damaged corridors and open decks. Supplies ran thin, fatigue dulled movement, yet care continued, driven by habit and obligation, rather than hope of success. Survival, in its most basic form, became the measure of victory. Amid the mass destruction, individual acts of bravery endured. They were rarely dramatic in form. A sailor refusing evacuation to keep a pump running. A signalman maintaining communication despite shrapnel wounds. A junior officer taking charge after senior command was lost. These moments did not alter the outcome of the battle, but they shaped how it would be remembered by those who lived through it. Survivor accounts later returned to the same themes: the suddenness, the disbelief, the sense that the world had shifted faster than understanding could follow. Men spoke of hearing aircraft before seeing them, of realizing too late that the attack was not ending, only cycling. Fear was constant, but so was function. Training asserted itself even as comprehension failed. Hands moved because they had been taught to move. Official reports emphasized endurance under extreme conditions. Crews adapted to damage they had never rehearsed. Decisions were made with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. These documents were precise, measured, and technical. Yet between the lines, they revealed something less quantifiable: the cost of maintaining order when survival demanded improvisation, and of sustaining discipline when certainty had vanished. The casualties themselves told a broader story. Modern naval warfare had become both brutally destructive and narrowly precise. Ships were not lost to chance, but to method. Men were not killed randomly, but because they occupied spaces that doctrine had once deemed secure. Precision did not reduce suffering. It concentrated it. Each technological improvement sharpened the consequences of miscalculation. From this, lessons emerged that could not be separated from the losses that produced them. Preparedness was no longer theoretical. Coordination was not optional. Vigilance could not lapse without consequence. These truths were written not in manuals, but in casualty lists and survivor testimony. They carried weight precisely because they had been paid for in human terms. As the wounded were evacuated and the dead recorded, one understanding settled over the aftermath. The battle had not been won by machines alone, nor lost by them. Technology had enabled destruction at scale. In the months that followed, navies across the world examined the battle not as an isolated event, but as evidence. Carrier warfare had moved beyond experiment and theory. It had proven decisive under combat conditions, reshaping assumptions that had governed fleets for decades. The implications extended far beyond a single engagement. Doctrine itself required revision. At the center of this shift was coordination. Carriers could no longer operate as auxiliary assets protected by surface forces alone. Instead, destroyers and escort ships were reorganized around them, forming integrated screens designed for both offense and defense. Anti-aircraft fire, submarine protection, radar coverage, and logistics were aligned to preserve the carrier's ability to strike first and withdraw intact. The fleet became a system, not a hierarchy. Enemy losses forced painful reassessment. Fleet composition, once dominated by battleships, now appeared unbalanced. Capital ships without adequate air cover were liabilities, not anchors of strength. Engagement strategies that sought decisive surface battles gave way to layered approaches, emphasizing detection, denial, and attrition from range. The purpose of naval power shifted from confrontation to control. Speed emerged as a defining factor, not simply speed of ships, but speed of decision-making and execution. Carrier groups that could reposition quickly imposed uncertainty on the enemy, compressing their reaction time and widening their margin for error. Communication systems were redesigned to support this tempo, prioritizing clarity, redundancy, and real-time coordination across air and sea. Intelligence followed the same logic. Accurate, timely information became the currency of survival. Reconnaissance aircraft, radar networks, and signals intelligence were no longer supplemental, they were foundational. The ability to predict an enemy's movement or to conceal one's own now shaped outcomes before the first aircraft launched. Surprise was no longer a matter of chance. It was engineered. The integration of air power into fleet operations transformed long-term planning. Training emphasized joint operations between pilots, deck crews, and surface commanders. Exercises simulated sustained strikes rather than isolated sorties. Command structures flattened to allow faster adaptation. The carrier ceased to be just a ship. It became a mobile airfield, intelligence hub, and command center combined. Technological foresight rose in importance alongside industrial capacity. Building ships was no longer sufficient. Success required anticipating how technology would be used, not merely acquiring it. Radar, aircraft performance, communications, and logistics had to evolve together. A Navy that failed to integrate these elements risked obsolescence, regardless of its numerical strength. As these lessons spread, in retrospect, the image that endured was not a single explosion or sinking ship, but a horizon transformed. 17 carriers advancing in coordinated force came to symbolize something larger than numbers or tonnage. They represented audacity disciplined by planning, innovation guided by restraint, and a willingness to challenge assumptions that had once seemed immutable. What appeared suddenly in the sky had been years in the making. For Japan, the battle exposed a fatal flaw in certainty. Battleship supremacy, long treated as an axiom, collapsed under conditions it could not control. Heavy armor and large guns offered no protection against an enemy that refused to fight on familiar terms. The fleet had been prepared for a confrontation that never occurred, and in that mismatch between expectation and reality, advantage dissolved. Yet the outcome was not decided by technology alone. Aircraft, radar, and carriers mattered, but only insofar as they were used well. Technological mastery amplified human skill, not replaced it. Pilots who held formation under fire, engineers who kept decks operational, commanders who trusted preparation over impulse all turned capability into consequence. Courage without coordination would have failed. Coordination without courage would have stalled. Together, they proved decisive. What emerged was a new understanding of power at sea. Fleet coordination, careful planning, and sustained morale converged into something more potent than any single weapon. Strength no longer resided in individual platforms, but in systems that could sense, decide, and act faster than an adversary. Victory belonged to those who could align people, machines, and information into a single purpose. The battle's deeper lesson lay in hubris. Confidence that resists evidence becomes vulnerability. Preparedness that assumes repetition becomes blindness. Warfare evolves not gradually, but through moments that expose what doctrine has failed to imagine. On that day, evolution arrived not as theory, but as fire and smoke, forcing recognition where persuasion had failed. The shock experienced by the defeated fleet ensured that this lesson would not be forgotten. Carrier warfare was no longer debated, it was accepted. Its legacy would shape shipbuilding, training, and strategy for decades to come. Every navy that followed would measure itself against what had been demonstrated, not what had once been believed. In the end, the horizon told the story more clearly than any report. Where once there had been calm certainty, there was now rupture. Where there had been laughter, there was reckoning. The sea had not changed, but the way war was fought upon it had, irrevocably. Japan laughed at the carriers. Then the horizon exploded, and nothing would ever look the same at sea.